Chet, I'm a little worried about this intro. I don't think we really didn't rehearse this at all.
This is going to come off completely unscripted, even though we went over and over and over again. I think it's very spontaneous.
I'm specifically worried about the intro, though.
Hello and welcome to What's New in Android. We're glad you could make it into the room. We're sorry that they put it in the smallest room at Shoreline.
That's true.
So there is standing room out there. If there's a seat next to you, if you could raise your hand so that people know that there's still one available someplace, that would help. I'm Chet Haas from the Android UI Toolkit team.
I'm Dan Sandler from the Android System UI team.
And I'm Romain Guy from the Android team.
Again? Once again?
But not on his team, never again.
No. No, that mutiny was successful, and we're not going to repeat that problem. So today, we're going to talk about what's new in Android. Specifically, given the timing of all the preview stuff going on, let's talk about what's new in N. Hello, there we go. We could even call it what's new in Android. Actually, what we should actually call it is what's new-ish in Android. Because we've talked about some of this stuff, and hopefully everybody here has the preview bits already, and you've been playing with it and submitting bugs and playing with the new features and functionality. So we're going to go over that, and we're also going to go over some of the stuff that's newer in the Developer Preview 3 and some other related bits. So let's do it. So the big question is, what does N stand for, of course? I think it stands for... So we went Russian this time, of course, and yet stands for not yet. We're not going to tell you. What it actually stands for today, of course, is N Preview. And in particular, it stands for N Preview 3. So let's talk about, there's different ways to slice and dice the features, but we thought it'd be useful to talk about the ones that the users can actually see and the developer side of that. And then we'll talk about the developer-facing features, the things that are more about the implementation and the code behind it. So why don't we start with a demo. Yay. So let's talk about constraint layout. This got a brief mention in the keynote this morning. Steph was talking about this, and Romain is going to show you what's going on.
So constraint layout is a brand new layout for Android. It's going to be an unbundled library that you can integrate in your application without updating the framework. It's compatible all the way back to Gingerbread, so you can use it in any app you want. And it is our first layout that was designed in conjunction with the tool itself. So as we were building the layout manager for Android, we were also designing this user experience for Android Studio. You saw briefly in the keynote, it was maybe a little hard to see. We have the system that automatically infers constraints. There are different ways in this new system that you can create a layout. So here, for instance, I have a button. You can see as I move it around, we give you guidelines. It shows you, it follows the material design guidelines, so it will show you the correct margin that you should use between different widgets. It shows you the correct margin between the widget and the edge of the screen. Now, if I add a second button, I can create a constraint between those two buttons, and now they are aligned. But what's really powerful in this new layout editor is that we run the algorithm behind the Android layout in Android Studio at 60 frames per second. So when I move the first button, you can see in real time what's happening, how the layout is resolving all the constraints. So this should give you a lot, much faster feedback on what's going on. We can also show you before you create a constraint. So as I'm dragging this constraint to the edge of the screen, we'll show you before I release the mouse, we animate to show you what's going to happen if you create that constraint. I'm sure some of you have used relative layout, and I might have been surprised by what happens sometimes when you just add an extra widget, and everything just teleports to a different part of the screen. So no more. So I can very quickly create more constraints, and I have my two buttons at the bottom. You can also use auto connect. So if I turn it on, when I drop a new button on screen, when you see guidelines, for instance, in the center of the screen, if I drop my button here, the system is going to create automatically the constraints for me, so I don't even have to do that work. You can, of course, edit the constraints after the fact. You can do flexible sizing, so you can take up all the space or none of the space. We also have percentage-based positioning. So here the button was in the center, but you can say that you want to be at, let's say, 25% from the top of the screen, and it's going to adapt to your screen dimensions. There are other features that we're going to demo on Friday at 9 a.m. For instance, we have aspect ratio, so you can make a widget always be a 1-to-1 aspect ratio or 16:9, whatever you want. And finally, the thing that was briefly previewed in the keynote. So if I drop a bunch of widgets on screen, let's say a text field from the top, a text view for a label, and I position them carefully the way I want my UI to look like. I'm going to destroy all the constraints. Now, if I just press this little label icon, it will figure out what I want it to do, and my layout just works. And you're not locked down. You can keep adding constraints. You can keep changing the behavior. I could add another widget, do automatic inference again, and you have this iterative process to help you make your UI, create your UI faster.
Thanks, Romain.
Sorry, one more thing. This is a preview. We call it the alpha one. It's a little rough around the edges, so download the Android Studio 2.2 preview, play with it. Please file bugs. I'll go personally look at the bug tracker, and I'll harass the engineers to make sure they fix hopefully most of the bugs. And we have a lot more coming. We're still going to work on it. This is by no means a final version of the layout and the layout editor.
One final question. How much does it cost?
100 kilobytes.
But for you, Chet?
$4 million. All right. So yes, go please play with it. Give us feedback. If we can go back to the slides. It was an awesome demo, but I'd like to see slides again.
Good luck following that.
Excellent. Multi-window. One of the more visible changes in N is the ability to actually have multiple activities on the screen at one time. There's two major modes of this that you may see around. One is split screen, side by side, or if you're running vertically, top to bottom. So if we go into recents, we can see in the screen record here, you've got the ability to drag from recents into one half of the screen, and then the thing you were doing is in the other half of the screen, and you can tap one of those to be your second activity. As you drag around, you'll notice that the window manager is simply quickly painting a background color until you let go, and then you get a full configuration change. So one of the things that makes this work basically out of the box for your apps is the magic of Android layouts. We know how to do configuration changes. We know how to adjust layout based on new sizes and form factors of the screen. So the window manager is building on top of that so that when you go into the new size enforced by the side-by-side layout, your app simply works. So go ahead and test it. Make sure that it works the way you want it to in side-by-side mode or split-screen mode. And use the APIs if you need to. So you can opt into this. You are automatically opt into it by default. But you can say that you do not want to be a resizable activity. There are some parameters that you can specify about default and minimal sizing. And there are some APIs for you to listen to find out when the system is going into multi-window mode or whether you are currently in multi-window mode. And then finally, if you are in multi-window mode and launching another sub-activity that you would like to be side-by-side with yours, you can ask for it to be adjacent to yours. So go please check that out, and also check out the picture-in-picture mode. So this is the other half of multi-window mode where in Android TV, you now have the ability to have an activity playing a picture-in-picture, so playing a video full-time while there's some other activity like the launcher, so the user can pick another piece of content to watch at the same time while you've got this video playing on the front screen. So for both of these features and lots more, please go to the multi-window session today at 4 p.m. There's a little bit of activity for picture-in-picture, basically similar to what we saw for multi-window mode to find out when these things are happening and what you can do about it. There is new drag-and-drop capability. We've had drag-and-drop in the platform since at least Gingerbread. And we have added to that capability now because now you're in a multi-window mode. Wouldn't it be nice if you could drag from one activity to another, which the previous drag and drop mode did not allow because it didn't need to. But now you want to actually be able to drag content back and forth between these multiple activities. So we added a little bit of API and capabilities to allow you to do that. So we can see some of the APIs here. A lot of it is around permissions, because maybe that activity didn't actually want you to copy from the password field onto your own activity. Or maybe you don't want that cat video dropped onto your activity. So there's a bit of handshaking back and forth to grant the correct permissions. And then there's also ways to actually start the actions, to cancel the actions while they're on the fly, to update the drag shadow, the very inappropriately named drag shadow. That's basically the thumbnail representation of the piece of content that's being dragged around. So you can update that to whatever you want. You can even keep updating if you really want to animate the shadow representation, if that's a thing. So we can see a quick screen record. You can see this in action here. Let's see. Yeah, so this is a couple of demos that we have internally. This will be published as an article and demo that you can run externally. It just shows the basic interaction of dragging something that doesn't have permissions versus granting the permissions and then getting the capability to drag between the apps. Moving on, so we have notifications.
All right, so you've all seen us do this talk before, I hope, and you know this is the part where I hijack the conversation for 15 whole minutes to talk about all the shiny new stuff in notifications. Well, not this time because they gave me my own talk. So come back tomorrow at 9 a.m. and we'll go really deep on all the exciting new stuff in notifications in Android N and in Android Wear 2.0, which you saw at the keynote. I will just, no, I'm not quite done, hang on. I do want to just highlight a few things that I want you to be aware of, perhaps entice you to come learn more or check it out in the developer docs. First, we have new templates for the first time really since Honeycomb, although we did do a bit of a material update a couple of releases ago. So new templates, moving things around a little bit, creating new attribution for the app that sent the notifications so you always know who is putting stuff in front of your face. We also have bundled notifications, something that we originally developed for Android Wear, finally available on the handset and on tablets, the ability to group those notifications together. We also have direct reply, the ability to touch the reply button and actually just type the text right in the shades. So this is, again, something that Android Wear has had for a while so that you could talk to your watch and have it sent as a text message. Now you can do the same thing even from the lock screen if the user has allowed it. While I'm up here and talking about system UI things, I would like to talk to you about quick settings. We've finally done something that users have been asking for a long time, which is make them editable, allow you to choose to add and remove the quick settings that you want to see. And in fact, we have this great new thing called the Quicker Quick Settings. I think I just came up with that. The Quicker Quick Settings is the list of your five top quick settings that appears at the very top of the notification list anytime you're looking at it. So if you move those around to get the top 5 in there, you'll have access to them one touch away anytime you're looking at your notifications. But wait, there's more. So developers, if you've been playing along at home, you know from the N preview that you can create your own quick settings tiles now that any user using Android N can choose to install. So go ahead and take a look at the API docs around tile service. This creates a whole life cycle around quick settings tiles that allows you to know when the user has added the tile to the list, when the tiles are actually being looked at. So if you need to do live updates, you can do them then. And then, of course, the all-important what to do when the user clicks on the tile. When you call getQSTile, you get a pointer to the tile object, which actually holds all your state and lets you do things like change the icon, change the label, go into and out of an active state, which lets you dim it or not dim it based on whether that resource is available. And then once you make all those changes, please don't forget, call update tile. So this is perfect for your settings, some quick feature of an app that you know the user wants to have access to from the lock screen. If you are busy building out your smart home, the first thing you want to do is have a quick button from your phone where you can turn it on and make it play your theme music as soon as you walk home. That's exactly what quick settings is for. The last thing you have to do is blah, 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 stuff in the manifest, just to make sure you get all the correct permissions so that System UI knows that you're a quick settings tile and knows what to do with it. Let's talk for a little bit about display size. So this is actually an accessibility feature that we're introducing in N to augment and even replace font size. So font size is something you've been able to change on Android for a long time. Developers, you know that if you specify your typefaces in SP, that multiplies in the user's chosen font size, so you can let the user say, I need a little bit more help, or I want to be able to see a little bit more text on the screen. But what you as developers probably also know is that SP is very limited, right? We don't really change layouts based on the font size. You can do wrap content to get around that, but there are certain parts of the system, like notifications, that really didn't deal very well with that because the size of the geometry just did not change to accommodate all the additional text. So what we have now in Android N is a display size feature. You go into the display settings, you hit that, and it changes the DPI of the device at runtime. It becomes a new way to change all of the UI on the device to a new density, not just the text, so you can blow everything up or shrink it all down to make the most use of that tiny little screen you've got there. So you can go from 0.85 all the way up to almost 1.5. I shouldn't have to tell you this at this point, but please avoid PX in your layouts, because since this is changing the density of the device, this gets multiplied in when you use dips in your layouts and your other computations. The other thing that you want to do, and I'll show you a video in a second that makes this really clear, is make sure your app works really well on SW320DP. I know we're all carrying around these giant, slabs of phones, and there are very few tiny displays out there. But suddenly, if a user changes the density such that the screen is effectively SW320DP, now your app needs to deal with that in a graceful way. So we've got a video here that shows actually what happens. This is the live resize. You go into display size, you move this slider around larger and smaller, and you can see that everything changes size, not just the text, but the navigation bar, status bar, and all that good stuff. And in fact, I have the breakdown here. This is what default size looks like. If you just change the font size, some things get bigger, but some things are unaffected. And then, of course, display size changes everything. So you can finally make every part of the UI big enough for you to see or small enough for you to feel like you can pack all that information in there. Let's talk about locales.
Let's do that. All right, thanks, Dan. Multi-locale. No, I haven't done it yet. Now, what's awesome is seeing the geometry and the shape of the awning based on the empty seats in the auditorium. It is really hot back there, isn't it?
It's a reason to watch the 360 feed.
But it's not hot at home for the live stream. All right, so for you people playing at home, let's talk about multi-locale. This has been a much requested feature for many releases now, and it turns out that outside of my country, people speak more than one language. It's true. I have been told this. People like you. And for these people, it's very difficult to deal with the UI because sometimes you would like some content or some apps to speak to you in one of those preferred languages or to have a different fallback than some other system default when it didn't have the appropriate resources. Whatever. There's many situations where you actually want a set of multiple languages and locales that it can handle. So we now have that. So you can not only select all these multiple languages, but you can reorder them based on what you want to do on the device. And you can also add some of the new languages and variants that we've added. So we've got a little screen record here where we show how you select this. You go into languages. I only had one selected. I don't know why that is. So let's go in and pick Deutsch. Actually means German, not Dutch, just for your information. And I picked the Liechtenstein variation of it because I thought that was funny. And then I reordered it and put it on first, and all of a sudden I can't read my UI because now that has become the primary language for the entire system. So multi-locale, please go out and use it. Let's talk about doze mode. So we had doze mode in Marshmallow already. So I'm going to do a little review. I stole a diagram from the system health people. So that I thought it was pretty self-explanatory. I could just pop the diagram up there, and you'll kind of immediately understand what doze mode is about. It's sort of obvious, but I'll use some highlights and sort of point out the important parts of this. First of all, doze mode kicks in after a while. The screen is off, this device is stationary, and it's running on battery. So it runs for a while, and then it goes into this doze mode down there that you can see. The little green section down there, and then there are these maintenance windows that come along where now all of a sudden activities are allowed to actually take part in the system and do their normal stuff during these maintenance windows. And then we have these recurring sort of an exponentially increasing duration between these maintenance windows. And so these happen over time. And then in the meantime, we have these doze modes where the activities aren't doing much. There's no network activity. There's deferred jobs and syncs. There's no wake locks. It's all good. It allows the battery to last a lot longer. So all of this is self-explanatory. But then let's go in and talk about N. So in N, we have all of that stuff, but then we also have this additional sort of lighter weight mode of doze where now you don't actually need to be stationary. So it's also a heavy that a phone can be in someone's pocket for a very long time and not actually being used. So wouldn't it be nice if the activities weren't consuming a lot of battery at that time? So they detect this situation where it's not stationary. They wait for a little while, and then they go into the doze mode. And then they have these maintenance windows. You have lessened activity, not as restrictive as the Marshmallow, but similar concept here. And again, all self-explanatory here. We'll notice on the diagram that you have similar colors for some of the elements there. It must mean that they're dozing similarly. And then finally, we have similar barcodes. So all of this makes sense. Let's point out that the capabilities in N, the sort of lighter weight doze that I was talking about, that's actually a superset of the functionality already. We have all the stuff from M when the device is actually stationary, plus this lighter weight all at the same time. So if we really want to make sense of it, then we put the diagrams together, and then it looks more like this. So I think, as I said, this is obvious. Some people thought I should use words and more, so we'll go quickly over that. In Marshmallow, you have the device, the screen is off, it's on battery, and it's stationary. And at that time, you're restricted from using the network. Your deferred jobs, syncs, alarms, no wake locks. Services restricted. In N, lighter weight, all of the above, but it doesn't have to actually be stationary. It can be moving around in your pocket or wherever. And then you have a less of a restriction because there are some background activity that's still valid to take place at that time. Please go to the battery and memory optimizations talk today at 5 p.m. to learn more details about this, as well as other system health stuff. And when I'm talking about system health stuff, let's talk about Project Svelte. So this is a project that was started a couple of releases ago to look at all the stuff that is going on in the system that is causing the battery to drain significantly, and then see what we can tell developers to do to fix their applications and address that need, and also what we can do on the platform side. We did that, and in N, you can say goodbye to the following actions. I'm sure we'll all miss them terribly, but they had to go. So there were these situations that we detected in the research that that team was doing where something would happen, like a connectivity action message would occur, and all these activities would wake up because they really, really, really wanted to know when the Wi-Fi network changed. So you're walking around your corporate building, moving from one router to the next, and all these activities wake up and they say, OK, what's to do? Nothing. And then they would go back to sleep. And in the meantime, the system is thrashing because they're all waking up. They can't all fit in memory at the same time. So we're killing off old ones so that the new ones can start. And we just get into this horrible thrashing situation. Similarly, for new videos and new pictures, the user took a picture and some expense report application on your phone decides, oh, it wants to know about new pictures because maybe they took a picture of a receipt. So the activity wakes up along with 40 of its best friends and realizes that it does not care about the picture of the cat that you just took, and then it goes back to sleep. So similar thrashing, why don't we reduce that stuff and make the battery and lifetime of the device much better for the user by simply not sending those anymore. Instead, the new approach is to use Job Scheduler, which we have been talking about for a couple of releases now. In particular, there's a new API that you should pay attention to that allows you to ask for when content is changed. Not immediately, because that was the problem with the old approach, but eventually. When that job gets scheduled, then you can find out if there's new media that you care about. Again, go to the battery and memory optimization session to learn more about this stuff.
And then that app can absolutely let you expense that cat.
Yes. Yes, it turns out that that was a valid picture for the expense report. Yeah, good point. Thanks. All right, Data Saver. It is now possible for the user to tell the device, tell the system that it wants to restrict the amount of data that specific apps are using. So here in the place that I live, I really don't worry too much about Wi-Fi, and I'm on a data plan where I'm not really capped. It's not that big a deal. That is not true the world over, obviously. People may pay really high premiums on their network access, or it may be really slow, so they don't want everyone to use up the limited bandwidth that they have, or maybe they're metered. So we're giving them the ability to really clamp down on that and not only tell us to use less data, but also to tell specific apps whether they are allowed to use data restricted or not. So there's a place where you can go in system settings now where you can basically toggle this on a per application basis. On the developer side, that means that you need to pay attention to this because you may be restricted at any time. So there's mechanisms in the system for you to find out whether this is happening. So you can query for the connectivity service and then find out whether you're A, metered on a metered network at the time, and B, whether background's access is actually restricted at that time.
Direct boot, one of my favorite new features in Android N. So if you have a PIN code set on your device and you've encrypted the device, if the device happens to reboot for some reason because you took an update, or we have automatic update, or because of a spontaneous reboot, you would find your device sometimes sitting on the PIN code screen, waiting for you to enter the PIN code, and you might be missing text messages or emails or even phone calls. So now what the system does instead, it will boot all the way to the lock screen before asking for your PIN code. And until you enter your PIN code, some applications will be able to run, and you can register your application to be able to run in this direct boot mode, which means that sitting on that lock screen, you will have access to some of the functionalities, like getting phone calls or text messages. So if you want to know more about it, if you want to know what you can do in your application to enable that mode, please attend the talk on Thursday at 9 a.m. It's going to be in the Android security talk. Another feature that's been widely requested was specific access to specific directories on the external storage. So if your application needs to look at the pictures or the music or the videos or whatever on the user's external storage, up until now, you had to request access for the entire storage. And it was a bit of a scary permission for users when they were downloading the application from the Play Store. So now instead, as we see here in the screenshot, your application can specifically request access to one directory like pictures or just music. And combined with the new permission system in M, it becomes very clear to the user what the application is trying to do and what the application is going to be able to access.
So Android for Work, I would encourage you to go to their session. There's a lot of stuff going on there. I just wanted to call out a couple of features, in particular in Android for Work in this release. So go to the session Thursday, 2 a.m., your apps at work. Please tune into that. But in the meantime, if you have a work profile installed on your phone, there's a new feature called Work Mode, which actually it's about disabling work mode. So it's sort of, let's put an exclamation point in front of that, not work mode. Basically, you can go into quick settings and easily toggle it off. And you'll see, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, the work profile applications were just disabled. So if you click on one of those, you'll get a little dialog saying, no, that's disabled right now. So it's easy to turn that on and off so you can spend the weekend actually not checking work email if that's your choice. There's also something called Work Challenge, which can hopefully get away from some of the ugly authentication stuff that companies have had to do, so they require this extra restrictive password stuff on the lock screen. They don't need to do that anymore. Instead, they can provide a password that is only used when one of the work profile apps runs. So we'll see a little screen record of that. So you launch a work profile app, it confirms your password here, it launches the app. Now if you go in and run one of the other work apps, it just goes immediately into it because you've already authenticated into the entire system.
So now the real reason why we're here, the features for developers. So the first big one was also mentioned in the keynote, it's changes to the runtime. So now we have a much faster interpreter, which means when your application is installed, it's not compiled ahead of time, like in Lollipop and Marshmallow. It's first going to run into interpreted mode. And when the JIT sees pieces of code in your application that run very often or that would benefit from higher performance, it's going to kick in and compile things just in time. Then when your device goes into idle mode, we're going to use some of the information gathered by the JIT to pre-compile ahead of time parts of the application. So we're really doing three things: interpreter, JIT, and ahead of time compilation. So it took us a few years. We tried all three in the past, so now we're doing all three at the same time. I really recommend that you attend the talk on Friday at 1 p.m. from the art team, the evolution of art. They're going to give you way more details about how all that works. We also have new runtime libraries. One of the big new ones is ICU4J. It's now part of the framework. ICU is a library that's useful for globalization, internationalization of your application. It's a fairly large library, so it's now part of the framework. We use a different package name so that we don't clash with the existing package names. And you can now rely on it being in the framework so you can reduce the size of your APK. We also added some new java.util packages. So there's java.util.function that contains classes and APIs that are useful for functional style programming like predicates. We also have the new streaming API that is extremely useful when you combine it with some of the new language features. So if you want to use some of the new Java 8 programming language features, you have to change your Gradle build file to switch to the new Jack compiler. You also have to say that you want source and binary compatibility with the 1.8 version of the programming language. And when you do that, you have access to lambdas, for instance. So lambdas are implemented using anonymous inner classes, speaking too quickly, which means they're backward compatible all the way back to Gingerbread. So you have some examples of what lambdas are. If you don't know what they are, if you've never used them, there's tons of documentations and articles online. Go look at them. It's going to make your life a lot better, especially if you use things like RxJava or just the Android UI framework. Anything that requires a lot of listeners, lambdas make it a lot easier. Just be careful though, because those things create anonymous classes. They are a little more costly than they seem, but It shouldn't matter much in most applications. Default and static interface methods are two very useful features that are not, unfortunately, backward compatible. So if you have an existing interface, you can now add new methods and provide default implementations, very much like what you can do in abstract classes. Again, very useful to move your APIs forward without breaking everything or your clients. And you can even use them to create the famous adapter pattern that you've probably seen with a lot of listeners. So you have a listener that has several callback methods, and typically there's an adapter class that comes next to it that has just an empty implementation of all those methods, so that when you want to implement only one of the methods, you don't have to declare all of them. So it's very easy to do now with the default methods. And you can also have static methods on interfaces. Repeating annotations, I'm sure many of you who are using all those fancy frameworks with tons of annotations will love that feature. It's also, unfortunately, not backward compatible, but it means that now a single annotation, there's an example at the bottom, @exportable, can be written several times on the same type. So for instance, here we have a class that we want to be able to serialize in different formats. We can just repeat the annotation instead of using arrays of values in the annotation. The audio team, the media team, has been working really hard in previous versions of Android to reduce audio latency. Most of that work previously was done in the native levels of the system. And in end, they worked on reducing the latency of audio in the upper levels. So you can expect, depending on your device, of course, a 40 to 70 millisecond latency reduction when you play audio. It's very easy to enable. There's an example right here on screen. When you create the audio attributes for your media player, you can just set the flag low latency, and we're going to give you access to that new feature. There's also a couple new APIs that you can use to improve the playback. You can create a number of underruns that happen while you're playing your media back. And you can also dynamically resize your buffers to take action when there are too many underruns. If you want to know more about it, especially if you want to know how to use the underlying native APIs to increase your latency even further, you can go to the talk on Thursday at 3 p.m. RenderScript, a bunch of improvements. So now in a single source file, you can have many kernels that they can call one another. It makes it a lot easier to create complex compute programs. We also have reduction kernels, so you can do MapReduce type of APIs. For instance, if you need to compute a histogram, you can do that with a reduce kernel. You have access to multiple images. We added allocation.getByteBuffer, which is going to help you reduce the number of allocations that happen when you run a RenderScript kernel. And finally, if you process a lot of data, we have support for 16-bit floating points, which help you cut the size of your data in half. And if the precision works for you, you should definitely look into it. For graphics people out there, OpenGLES 3.2, that's the newest version of OpenGLES that we ship with Android N. It is effectively OpenGLES 3.1 plus something that's called the Android Extension Pack. The Android Extension Pack was a bundle of OpenGL extensions that if the extension pack itself was present on the device, you are guaranteed to have access to all those extensions. It was making the life of OpenGLES developers a lot easier. So this has been folded into the actual specification of OpenGLES 3.2, except one of the extensions that you can see on the slide. And some of the highlights include advanced blending equations. So now the hardware can take care of doing all the blending modes that you find in Photoshop or other image processing application. You don't have to write shaders for that anymore. It's part of OpenGL. You can use tessellation and geometry shaders. Those are very useful to generate geometry at runtime. So typically what you can do is you have a fairly simple mesh, and as the camera gets closer to the object, you can add more and more triangles dynamically to make it look smoother on screen without paying a huge memory cost or performance cost when you don't need those extra triangles. There's a new texture compression format called ASTC, and a couple of other features that if you use OpenGLES, you will care very much about. Vulkan was also mentioned in the keynote, so a little more details. There's going to be a talk about it on, today at 6 p.m. So Vulkan is a low-level API to do graphics. It's lower level than OpenGL. In some way, you effectively become the driver. So you can generate commands for the GPU from multiple threads, which is going to help improve the efficiency of your application. There's not as much overhead in the driver itself, so you can make more draw calls. You can put more objects on screen. You can also pre-compile your shaders offline, which is very useful to do validation or to do heavier optimizations, because the drivers on the device try to find a balance between optimizing your shaders and not spending too much time compiling them. It's also a cross-platform API, so Vulkan, as it exists in Android N, is the same as the Vulkan you will find on Windows and Linux. The drivers are shipping today, so you can even write your code on your desktop machine and then run it on your mobile device. It's also a little more difficult than OpenGL-ES. You have to do explicit memory management and synchronization. So we're going to probably see a huge uptake in Vulkan in middleware. So engines like Unity or Unreal Engine are working on supporting Vulkan or have support for Vulkan. So if you're using one of those engines, you're good to go. Your apps are going to be better for free.
There were improvements to ADB in terms of both functionality as well as performance. So we made it a lot more full-featured, more like a real shell, so you can actually get a lot more content from, let's say, LS. You can also take the results from things that happen in ADB and actually pipe them to other processes on the host. So much more full-featured stuff that you can do with that. And then there were also major performance improvements made specifically to push and pull by a really complex algorithm known as increasing the buffer size. So that's how we do things here at Google. So go use new ADB. You don't really have a choice, but you'll enjoy it.
Getting the process exit status and being able to pipe the standard input, to the remote device is particularly useful to automate testing, for instance. You can run a lot of things automatically on the device and get the correct results. A lot of changes to the NDK. We've upgraded Clang to 3.8 and GCC to 4.9. But even though we've updated GCC, this is the last version of GCC that will be supported by the NDK. So if you're still using GCC in the NDK, now it's time to test your application with Clang. It's time to move on, I would say. And we also made the default, the ARM7 architecture the default. So you can forget about the older architecture. So your binaries should benefit from more optimizations that make more sense for today's devices.
VR, we heard a little bit about that in the keynote, and you're going to hear a little bit more about that the rest of the week. I wanted to talk about the massive surface area of API that you need to be aware of. First of all, you need to know about the features on the device. The devices are a little specific to the capabilities that they have, as we heard in the keynote. And then next, there's this API that you need to be aware of. And I would say, for the rest of the details, please go to the sessions. It turns out there are a lot of them. Last time I looked, like 18 sessions on VR. So take your pick. I think one of the big ones where they're going to talk about some of the technical details are tomorrow morning at 9, perhaps. But look on the schedule. You'll know if it uses the phrase VR in it. It's kind of a...
Sorry, was that VR?
VR. Okay. And notice that's 4 quotes. That's not just 2. That's 4
quotes?
Yeah. Okay. On each side. All right.
I would just add, if you're not writing a VR experience, a game or a virtual museum or whatever, this API is not for you. Do not turn it on in your application just because you think it's going to make your app go faster. That is not for you. It's only for VR people.
All right. Not for you. All right, support library. This is not new in N, but I wanted to talk briefly and quickly about some of the things that have been in recent releases. So in the 23.2 release, we had a bunch of stuff that people were looking forward to. There's night mode capabilities, so the ability for your application to quickly toggle between light and dark themes. The bottom sheets UI for material design, and vector drawable and animated vector drawable. People have been asking this since we released the original feature on Lollipop, as if we didn't quite know. It turns out it was actually really tricky to implement because of the way resources are processed, as well as drawables, and making that work in a backward compatible way took a while. But finally, it's there. Goes back several releases. So please check those out, use them, and start shipping APKs that are smaller, because vectors tend to be a lot smaller than equivalent images, PNGs and JPEGs. Recycler view, auto measure, also wrap content. That has been a much requested feature for a while. So that was in that release. And then in 23.1, we made slight API adjustments to recycler view to allow much more performant as well as feature-rich item animations. So check those out as well.
Speaking of vector drawable, there's going to be a talk by Colt. Don't remember when. It's about image compression and what you can do to reduce the size of your APKs. So he's going to talk about vector drawables, but also what you can do with PNGs and JPEGs and WebPs to make your applications just smaller and look just as good.
Yes, that. Support library, I also wanted to talk about what I would like to call the future. There are some exciting things going on that developers are going to care deeply about. But we do have a session called What's New in the Support Library? And instead of stealing their thunder, I would say go check out that session today at 4 o'clock to learn about some of the stuff that's coming up in future releases of the support library. I want to quickly go over these because I like them. This is kind of an implementation detail. Nobody on the outside is going to know, but vector drawable performance improved greatly in the N preview release because we worked on performance improvements on both the loading side as well as the first draw side. So we create the bitmap and we draw it there, and we were taking a long time drawing that path. We sped that up. We also sped up just the act of parsing it. If you have a really complex path, it turns out that parsing that string at the Java level was very time intensive. So we have significant speed ups there, more of a reason to start using vector drawables. Also, float property and in property, my favorite feature is because I checked them in this release.
Is that the only code you wrote for N?
Possibly.
I'm pretty sure.
No, actually, I wrote a lot of other code, and I checked it in, and there were problems, so I checked it back out. Not only did I not actually write much code for float property and property, but I actually wrote it about 2 years ago, but it was hidden API. But we realized that people really couldn't access the capabilities of using primitives with the property object until these were exposed as public API. So there they are. Please use them, especially for animations. It allows you to have a much more direct method of setting properties without doing a typical mechanism we use in animators, where we dive down into J and I and back up. So it adds a little performance improvement. What else we got? Android Instant Apps. We saw this in the keynote this morning. You saw us go to the sandbox area and check out the demos, and also check out the talk that they have tomorrow morning, What's New in Android Play for Developers, and they'll have more details about that. And the most important thing, go get the release. If you don't have it yet, Developer Preview 3 should be out there now. I don't know the timing of sessions with when the bits actually hit the interwebs, but it should be there. Please go get it. Has some helpful URLs in case you don't know where d.android.com is. There it is. So go get the preview and go set up the SDK. And most importantly, please file bugs and do it really quickly. We're trying to finish this release. Is there anything else?
Should we take I just wanted to add a couple of things about constraint layout because I care deeply about it. There's also a code lab you can attend if you want to play with it already. Other than that, we can take a couple of questions. It's going to be awkward
we have
in
mics
this room,
in the
but
audience?
I don't know how we're going to take questions here.
just speak very loudly.
You know what? I will say for the other 2,000 of you that had questions that you couldn't ask, we are going to have office hours at the end of every day. There's an office hours called Android N office hours. There's actually going to be a lot of platform people there. The people that worked on N, it turns out, are the same people that worked on all the other releases. So please bring your questions there. And there's other more team-specific office hours for multi-window and stuff like that. So check it out on the schedule and come ask us questions then. I think we're going to skip the questions.
Right.
It's just kind of awkward there. So why don't we wrap it up, and we'll say thank you.
Thanks.